Hello and welcome to This Is What Came Out of Me, a podcast about anything and everything, but mostly pop culture from movies, TV, podcasts and YouTube. In each episode I talk about things that have grabbed my interest and things that I think that you out there in the big wide world might be interested in. I'm SierraKiloBravo, let's get into it. Today I'm going to take you back to 1932 to an area of Western Australia called Campion, to an event now known as the Great Emu War. While it's now an abandoned town, back in 1932 Campion was populated by a large number of ex-soldiers from Australia and Britain who had taken up farming in the region. The Great Depression had started a few years earlier and had reached this remote part of Australia. The farmers had been encouraged by the government to increase their wheat crops with promises of subsidies to incentivise them. However, those subsidies never came and tensions began to rise. And then to add to the troubles of these farmers, 20,000 emus arrived in the region as part of their regular migration cycle. Because the farming had cleared a lot of the land and increased water supplies, the emus thought that this was great. So they settled in longer than usual and even began to stick their beaks into farmland. As a result, the emus began damaging the crops, spoiling the land and ruining fences, which then in turn allowed rabbits in, thus creating more problems for the farmers. And here we see some of those great Aussie problem-solving skills. Being ex-soldiers, the farmers approached the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, and suggested that the deployment of machine guns would be an effective counter to this invasion. The minister agreed, albeit with some conditions. He stipulated that the machine guns had to be manned by military personnel. The costs for transporting the troops had to be covered by the Western Australian government, and the farmers had to feed and billet the soldiers and pay for the ammunition. Part of the minister's motivation for agreeing to all of this was that the emus would make for good target practice for the troops, easy targets to hone their skills. And so, the Great Emu War began. On November 2nd, 50 emus were sighted in Campion, and the soldiers were set to take them down in the first phase of the campaign. They were, however, out of range of the guns. The emus were wary, so the soldiers enlisted the help of the farmers to herd the emus into an ambush. The emus were smart though, and split into smaller groups which were harder to target. Eventually the soldiers opened fire, only to discover that the birds were still out of range. On a second occasion though, the birds were closer and in range, and a number of them went down. And later that day, in another action, around a dozen emus fell under the spray of the guns. 2 days later, the soldiers had set another ambush for their enemy. The location was near a dam, and around 1,000 emus had been spotted moving toward the position. As wily as they were, the emus had no idea of what awaited them, and approached oblivious to the soldiers. The soldiers in turn waited patiently for them to approach the kill zone where victory would be certain. The birds walked right into the trap and the soldiers opened fire, and 12 emus went down before the machine guns jammed and stopped firing. The rest of the flock retreated in fear, scattering across the landscape as they made their escape. The limited success to date was beginning to frustrate the soldiers and their commanders. They tried a few different tactics, such as moving to a location where the birds were considered to be more tame, and even mounting a machine gun on a truck, but all with no success. With regards to the truck-mounted machine gun, the emus simply outran the truck. It couldn't gain on them, and the ride was so rough that the gunner couldn't even get a shot off. November the 8th rolled around, marking the 6th and final day of operations. So far, 2,500 rounds of ammunition had been fired, but there was no confirmed number of kills, and figures ranged from 50 to 500 depending on who was telling the story. One thing was for certain though, and that came from the Commander Major Meredith. Our men have suffered no casualties. An ornithologist by the name of Dominic Cerveny summed it up. The machine gunner's dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus were soon dissipated. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split up into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic. A crestfallen field force therefore withdrew from the combat area after about a month. And so ended Phase 1 of the Great Emu War, with victory to the emus, wearing down the Australian army and outsmarting them with unconventional warfare. On the 8th of November, the army withdrew and the commanders were left to mull over their defeat. Major Meredith took a strategic view in his summary. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They're like Zulus who even dum-dum bullets could not stop. Dum-dum bullets are a type that expand on impact, and Meredith was possibly there referencing the Boer War. And by saying bullet carrying, he was referring to the bird's ability to take the shots, sustain injury, and keep on moving. So with the withdrawal of the troops, the emus continued to harass the crops and farmland, and things got to the point where not long after, the farmers again appealed to the government for help. As the weather got hotter, drought also came along with it, and thousands of emus in search of water came too. Major Meredith was deployed once again along with the machine guns. On the 13th of November, they took to the field again, and in the first 2 days of the second phase, they had more success than last time. 40 emus went down in that period, and for the next couple of weeks the machine guns took down around 100 birds per week. When Meredith was ordered to cease operations on the 10th of December, he claimed that they had made 986 kills with 9,860 rounds of ammunition shot. Further to this, Meredith said that a further 2,500 birds were injured in such a way that they would not have survived. So, was this victory for the Australians at last? Well, they may have won the battle, but they did not win the war. 2 years later, in 1934, the farmers in the region again requested military assistance to deal with an ever-growing force of emus. The numbers had grown so much that in a 6-month period in 1934, 57,034 birds were shot down. And then again in 1943 and 1948, the farmers continued to have issues bad enough that they had to ask the government for help. It seems that the emus were ultimately unstoppable, even to the point now where they are a protected species. They had the ultimate victory. And so ends this amusing part of Australian history, the story of the Great Emu War. And of course there is a moral to this story. Don't mess with Mother Nature, because she'll send the birds to get ya. While this is a true story, please be assured that I'm not mocking the Australian Army. It's just a good-natured ribbing from a New Zealander from across the ditch. Our Anzac fighting spirit is strong, even if our Aussie cousins can't win a fight against some birds. Well, that's all for this time. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out the notes for some links about the Great Emu War and give yourself a chuckle. Until next time, I'm SierraKiloBravo, and this is what came out of me.